I'm mic'd right now.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I think it's about time that we should get started. My name's Lloyd Weeks. I'm a Professor of Archaeology here at UNE, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 23rd Annual Maurice Kelly Lecture. In particular, I would like to welcome all of the attendees of the ASK conference and the members of the Australian Academy of the Humanities who are here tonight. A big welcome also to those, I hope many UNE students amongst them, who are out there live streaming this lecture out in the wild blue yonder on the internet. So welcome and greetings to you all this evening. It is my honour and primary duty tonight to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Julie Anderson. But before I do, I would like to take the opportunity to say just a few words about UNEMA, that is the UNE Museum of Antiquities, and the Maurice Kelly Lecture, and thank those whose sponsorship has made this evening's event possible. Established in 1959 as the Museum of Classics, in 2019, as I'm sure you're aware, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of UNEMA. The museum serves as an important resource for both UNE and the broader region and houses an excellent collection of antiquities from the ancient Mediterranean and the Near East, complemented by objects and ethnographic material from Australia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific and elsewhere. It holds particularly important collections of Cypriot antiquities reflecting generous bequests from luminaries such as J.R.B. Stewart and J. Basil Hennessy. The museum is an important resource for teaching and research by UNE staff and students and by external scholars, a resource that we are committed to protect, enhance and further integrate into our academic pursuits in the coming years. In memory of its founder, Dr. Maurice Kelly, each year UNEMA invites a distinguished researcher to present the Maurice Kelly Lecture. This lecture series, which began in 1997, would not be possible without the support of our generous donors and sponsors, and I would like to thank the UNEMA Maurice Kelly Lecture Fund, the AG and IC Macready Fund, and in particular the UNE Friends of Antiquity Society. The Maurice Kelly Lecture focuses on archaeology, museums and heritage, and often on matters related to the intersection of these subjects. Last year we heard from Professor Barbara Helving from the University of Sydney, who provided a fascinating behind-the-scenes view of the blockbuster exhibition entitled Iran, Ancient Cultures Between Water and Desert, which took place in Bonn, Germany. Previously, we've heard from curators at other Australian museums holding important collections of antiquities and from archaeologists working in areas as disparate as Australia, the Near East, the Mediterranean, Africa and Southeast Asia. Tonight, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Julie Anderson from the British Museum, an institution that, it must be acknowledged, is a little ahead of UNEMA in that it's celebrating its 260th anniversary this year, just a couple of centuries ahead, but we'll catch up, I'm sure. Dr. Anderson is curator of Sudan and Nubia at the British Museum, a title she's recently taken on. And in that role, she's responsible for curating the British Museum's magnificent Sudanese and Nubian collections. Her research interests include daily life and material culture in the Nile Valley and surrounding deserts, interests that she has pursued through fieldwork and excavations at numerous sites in Egypt and Sudan since the late 1980s. Currently, in addition to her curatorial work, she's the Honorary Secretary for the International Society for Nubian Studies. Dr. Anderson's publications include a 2017 co-authored monograph entitled Highlights from the Sudan National Museum and a 2004 edited volume entitled Sudan, Ancient Treasures. Since 1997, she's been a co-director of the British Museum Archaeological Excavations in the Berber Abadiya region in Sudan, in collaboration with the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums of Sudan. Dr. Anderson's current fieldwork is concentrated upon the rich and fascinating late Kushite site of Dangeil, and that is the topic of her presentation this evening. It is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Anderson to the stage to present her lecture entitled Excavating Dangeil, a voyage of discovery through intersecting cultures. Welcome.
Good evening. It's a real privilege to give the Maurice Kelly Lecture. And I'd also really like to thank the organizers of ASCS, the conference conveners, the staff at UNE for organizing such a wonderful conference and for their amazing hospitality and for their invitation to share with you some of my team's recent discoveries. Now, I'm afraid these aren't kangaroos, but you might recognize this gentleman, this rogue. He's a bit familiar. The bronze head of Caesar Augustus has long occupied a prominent place in the galleries of the British Museum and in the affections of its visitors. But what few people realize is that this dramatic imperial sculpture was discovered in Merowe, in Sudan, not in a part of the Roman Empire. In 1911, much to his surprise, John Garstang, a British archaeologist, found this head buried beneath the threshold of a temple in the Kushite royal city of Merowe. In antiquity, those people entering the temple would have purposefully walked on Caesar's head. So this is a definite insult here. Now, situated along the Nile, Merowe is approximately 200 kilometers north of modern-day Khartoum. So why was this head originally part of a complete statue so far from home? Strabo, the classical historian, records that in the 1st century BC, the Ethiopians, the people with the burnt faces, as the Kushites were known in the Greco-Roman world, attacked the southern border of the Roman province of Egypt, looting and pulling down imperial statues in Aswan, Elephantine, and Philae. They were led by a queen who was blind in one eye. Now, although they were later required to return their booty, it's clear that they didn't return everything, as the find of this head clearly shows. Now, Sudan's complicated history, its rich archaeological heritage and culture remains relatively little known to the modern world. Yet it's one of Africa's largest countries, which for thousands of years has connected the peoples of Central Africa and those of the Mediterranean world, with the Nile serving as a conduit for much of the time. There's also east-west routes connecting the sub-Saharan with the Red Sea. Now, our team, directed by myself, Mahmoud Suleiman, and Rahab Hidir from the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, Sudan, is conducting archaeological excavations at Dangeil. Dangeil means broken red brick in Nubian. And for those of you who are not familiar with the area, Dangeil is located on the right bank of the Nile, about 350 kilometers north of Khartoum. It was part of the Kushite kingdom, and it was an important royal city. Between the 3rd century BC and the 4th century AD, the kingdom of Kush stretched along the Nile from south of modern-day Khartoum to the edge of the Roman province of Egypt in the north. Late Kushite culture itself consisted of a mixture of Egyptian pharaonic, Greco-Roman, and indigenous African traditions and characteristics, as you can see here in this temple kiosk and in the royal burial field of the Kushite pyramids at Merowe. And they look a little bit like Egyptian pyramids, but they're smaller, and the angle of the slope of the pyramids are a little bit steeper. And I might also mention that there are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. You can also see these characteristics in the bowhead statue here, the boat fitting, and the stele that's depicting the goddess Amasemi and the Kushite queen Amani-Shekheto. Amani-Shekheto is one of the candidates for Strabo's one-eyed queen, although she's not the best candidate, to be fair. Excavations at Dangeil began in 2000. They've revealed a large, previously unknown late Kushite temple of the 1st century AD. It was dedicated to the god Amun, who is known in Kush as Amani. It's situated in the center of a sacred enclosure. We've also made a number of surprising discoveries that have cast light on the historical landscape interactions and the changing occupation of the region, beginning from the 8th century BC through to the 19th century, so basically the modern day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of these discoveries. Dangeil covers about 12 hectares and presented for us initially a unique opportunity to examine the characteristics of a temple, its complex, and to gain a greater insight into its role within Kushite society. Some of the mounds on the site stand higher than 4 meters, and each of these mounds represents an individually well-preserved building. Kushite religion was substantially influenced by its northern neighbor, Pharaonic Egypt. And of course, many of the Kushite gods are familiar from the Egyptian pantheon. But we don't really know very much of their religious beliefs before their conquest of Egypt in the mid-8th century BC. In Egypt, they're known as the 25th dynasty. The Kushites were eventually expelled from Egypt in the 7th century BC after war with the Assyrians. They withdrew southward into Kush, where they thrived for almost 1,000 more years, and they remained champions of the gods of Egypt, even after the Egyptians themselves had long abandoned them and become Christian. The Middle Nile region, the area of Kush, didn't convert to Christianity until much later, in the 6th century AD. Chief amongst the Kushite gods were Amun, Amani, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. But there's also local gods, and the most important was the lion god Apetamak, the god of war. Temples built for the Egyptian gods tend to be of a typical Egyptian plan, right down to the use of the Egyptian module of the cubit. The local gods have temples laid out using a classical module of column diameters. You might also notice in this picture here that Apetamak is wearing a Roman-type scale armor. This is a kite photo of Dangeil's temple. So to give you an idea of the scale that you're looking at here, the temple pylon under the red arrow is 5.5 meters wide, and it's standing 4 meters high. Most of the other walls are about 1 meter wide, and they stand up to 3 meters. The temple's constructed of a mixture of materials including sandstone, fired brick, mud brick. The sanctuary columns and facings and floor are of sandstone. But the rest of the temple, the walls are fired brick with mud brick cores, and the columns are created from fired red brick quarter circles or thirds. And the way they change the sizes of these columns is by changing the sizes of the galleting in between these quarters or thirds. The sanctuary columns are decorated with Meroitic hieroglyphs, and 8 fertility figures stride forward towards the sanctuary. These are adorable little figures. They have river plants and flowers on their heads. They've got plump stomachs, and they wear little short kilts. Each of them is carrying 2 water jars that are pouring offerings to the god Amun. Looking at the Meroitic hieroglyphs, Meroitic itself remains largely an undeciphered language. It's possible for us to read the words, but we don't actually know what they say. So what we need is a bilingual text. Basically, we need a dictionary. And it would be really nice for us to see things from the Kushite point of view, to be able to read what they're telling us, instead of reading about them from the texts of others, which, to be fair, could be pejorative or expressing opinions that are not their own. 2 complete altars were discovered in the sanctuary, along with the remains of a third that had the name of the queen Amani-Tori, who was another powerful Kushite queen. These are parts of her name in Meroitic hieroglyphs, and you can also see the side of her face with her crown and the double uraei, the cobras, that are sitting on top of her crown. She and her co-ruler, King Natakamani, likely built the temple's latest phase in the 1st century AD. And we have confirmed this dating with AMS and carbon-14 analysis. Dangeil was an important place in antiquity, and initially this was made clear by its size. Very simply, the temple is the same size as the Amun temple in the royal city of Meroe. That makes it, along with the temple at Merowe, the second largest temple in Sudan. Some artifacts excavated are also highly indicative of Dangeil's status. Granite statue fragments of early Kushite kings from the 7th and the 6th centuries were discovered scattered through the fill of this later 1st century AD temple. And this is my co-director at the time, Dr. Salah Mohammed Ahmed, unearthing one of them. This discovery was unexpected, to say the least, and it led to a substantial reanalysis of the geographic extent of the early Kushite kingdom and possibly of its later interaction with Egypt's 26th dynasty. But I'll come back to that in a minute. This is the fragment scatter in the south room of the temple. The fragments are found at different heights, at different levels. They're all over the place. The statues found included the torsos and the feet of the rulers Taharqa, seen here in red, Sanka-Menisken in green, and what was assumed to be the feet and the head of Espelta. These statues likely originated in an earlier royal foundation on the site. Now, Taharqa is the most famous of the Kushite kings, and he's a well-known pharaoh of Egypt. He's mentioned by name in the Bible, in 2 Kings and in Isaiah, and he saves Jerusalem from the Assyrians. Well, in theory at least. This is Taharqa's Sphinx from Kawa and his pyramid at Nuri. Both of these sites are downstream from Dangeil, so that's to the north. Now, the discovery of the statues, to be fair, was really, really exciting. But then you kind of realize that they're inside a room and you have to move them. You can't leave them there. So the transport, particularly of the Taharqa torso, which is about 1.5 times life size, and it weighs about 1.5 tons, constituted an enormous challenge for us, especially since there was extremely limited access to lifting equipment. We had none. So we used traditional methods, and in the end, 18 men moved the statue with ropes and levers. And then they all tried to get in the car afterwards. The Dangeil statues were broken at the weakest points: the neck, the hands, the knees, the ankles. This is Sanka-Menisken in situ, and you can see his name's inscribed on the back in cartouches, so we know exactly who he is. He's 3/4 life size, to give you an idea. Now, 2 groups of statues containing this same family of kings, so that's Taharqa, Tamwetamani, Sanka-Menisken, Anilimani, and Espelta, have been discovered previously in Sudan. These are the same guys as at Dangeil. One of them was at Jebel Barkal in 1916 by George Reisner, and the other, more recently, at Kermadouki Gale in 2003 by Charles Bonnet. These statues were broken in the same places as those at Dangeil. Now, the Barkal group was disturbed, but the statues likely came from the great Amun temple, B500. Jebel Barkal is the heartland of the kingdom of Kush. It's their great sacred temple. Amun, the Kushite god of kingship, is believed to reside inside this mountain. The red dots you see here on the screen are the location of the statue caches. So they're on either side of this temple. The Kermadouki Gale group was an intact sealed cache. That's really special. It was also associated with an Amun temple, and Charles Bonnet here is indicating the location of the excavated cache pit. The statues in all the groups come from a royal workshop and depict striding, bare-chested, kilted rulers with their names and titles inscribed on the back. They all share a similar iconography. These are the Duki Gale statues reconstructed in the Kerma Museum in northern Sudan. Now, the discovery of the statues at Dangeil, as I said, was surprising because Dangeil is located far upstream from Barkal. It's on the periphery of the 25th dynasty and the early Kushite kingdom. So several theories have been suggested to explain the reasons for their existence there and their deposition. The first being they originated in a cache that was disturbed during the destruction of the later 1st century AD temple. If the statue groups at Dangeil, Jebel Barkal, and Kermadouki Gael were broken and buried in caches around the same time, as the same family group of rulers is included in each of these, then there are several possible explanations. The first is that an external agent is responsible. It has been suggested that this guy, the invading Egyptian army of the 26th dynasty, the pharaoh Psamtik II, or known in the classical world as Psammiticus II, destroyed the statues during his campaign southward into Kush in the 6th century BC. Following their destruction, the statue fragments were then buried in caches. Within this theory, the responsibility for the breakages and the caches then could either lie wholly with the invading army, but more likely be divided between the Egyptians and the Kushites, with the former being the people who broke the statues and the latter the people who created the caches. This is one of Psamtik II's stelae at Shalal, just south of Aswan. It says he reached Pnubs. Pnubs is Kermadouki Gael, and he took 4,200 Nubian captives there. He may have reached Jebel Barkal, but there's no indication thus far that his army reached ever as far upstream as Dangeil. But negative evidence in and of itself is not evidence. Another suggestion has been internal political pressures, such as dynastic strife. This is Dangeil's Espelta. He's the latest ruler in the group. And despite his cherubic countenance, he looks like a really happy chap, he doesn't seem to have been very well liked. His names are erased from several inscriptions, including his election stela, which focuses on his legitimacy as ruler. Another stela, his banishment stela, records he had a dispute with the priests in the cult of Amun and executed a bunch of them. Doesn't make you popular. But what this might suggest is an official condemnation of him and by extension perhaps of his family, thus the statue breakage. Yet another explanation put forward for consideration is temple refurbishment. This explanation is not reliant upon the statue groups being cached at the same time. Doesn't exclude it, but they don't have to all be put in the ground at the same time. As far as can be determined, there's little monumental royal statuary in hard stone created following the reign of Espelta. So the early Kushite statues, particularly those in the Taharqa family group, would be the ones that were primarily present. There weren't any ones after that. These statues could have stood in the temples for several generations following Espelta. It's possible that the statues were cached when they outlived their earlier role and had no place in the later temples. So basically, this is house cleaning. What this might suggest then is that in places where significant early Kushite temples remained in use, particularly where they were remodeled or renewed during the late Kushite period, like Dangeil, there's a strong possibility of an associated statue cache. I have yet to be proved right on that one, but I'm hoping for it. Now, having only the head and feet and no inscribed name, Dangeil's Espelta statue remained largely incomplete, and its identification was tentative, and it was based upon comparisons with known figures such as this one. But recently, while excavating the main processional way in the middle of the temple's peristyle court, another fragment was discovered, and this was the kilt and thighs of a small statue. Well, Our conservators reassembled the fragments, and they joined the earlier ones, and Aspelta's name was inscribed on the back pillar. The preserved inscription reads, it begins with his praenomen, Ra, whose Ka is loved, followed by son of Ra, Aspelta, may he live forever. Beloved of Reharakti, given all life, stability, and dominion forever. Ra is, of course, the Egyptian sun god. So now we're just missing Aspelta's shoulders. But why were the statues at Dangeil in the first place? In the 7th century BC, the Kushites move north and they conquer Egypt. In the south, however, we don't know how far their kingdom extended. The extent of their rule is unknown. The presence of these statues at Dangeil might be part of the expansion of the early Kushite kingdom from Barkal southward. Dangeil must have been under direct royal control when a royal statue cult was established there at the beginning of the 7th century BC. That's the date of the earliest ruler. At this time, however, further upstream, we don't know what's happening at Merowe. And this is the royal city of the later Kushite kingdom. Evidence for royal construction there appears only later in the second half of the 7th century BC. So the question that we're asking ourselves now in this area is, when did the area come under direct royal control, and when was it simply within the zone of influence? So we're charting the movement of a kingdom. There is evidence for earlier building under the south rooms of the temple, including the remains of several large mud brick walls. They share the same orientation as the later temple, and some of the temple walls are built directly on top of them. This is the area that you're seeing here where the majority of the fragments of the early statues were scattered. There are also substantial walls that had been purposefully leveled underneath the first hall. So it's evident that the temple was constructed on top of an earlier, presumably sacred Kushite structure. It seems probable that these royal statues originated here. But apart from being able to say that there's an earlier building there, we're not able to substantially prove that this is a religious sacred structure. There were very few artifacts associated with this earlier building, but what we did find are of early Kushite date, and they're shallow wheel-made dishes, faience ram heads and lotus blossom plaques, and amulets. So recent excavations in the temple have concentrated on establishing its overall plan and gaining an idea of what the area might have appeared like in the past. In the peristyle court, the purpose was to expose the processional way and the area around the kiosk, and to determine, as with other Amun temples, this route had been flanked by a series of ram statue pairs. And you could see some ram statue pairs here at the Amun temple at Naga, which is an Amun temple just to the south of Dangeil. We'd expect to find ram statues because the ram is the avatar of the god Amun, and they seem to usually be associated with temples that are dedicated to this god. 6 pairs of statue plinths were found on either side of the kiosk, and they had numerous fragments of sandstone ram statues scattered around them. This is a fleece fragment, and it had traces of white lime plaster with matte blue pigment in the grooves between the scales. The statue may have been covered with plaster to hide imperfections in the stone, as well as to help the pigment adhere. Now, it's known that many ancient statues were painted, of course. Recent polychromy studies of microscopic traces of preserved pigment have led to, for example, to the reconstruction of the decorative program of this Horus figure in the British Museum. Several late Kushite statues from the royal baths in the royal city of Merowe also bear traces of pigment and are contemporary with the Dangeil rams. So here are some other ram fragments with visible traces of pigment remaining. We have analyzed these pigments, and the red and yellow are ochres, so hematite and goethite, while the blue is Egyptian blue, and that's a man-made copper-based pigment. Actually, it's the earliest man-made pigment apparently in the world. So, based upon the pigment traces visible on identifiable fragments, the original polychrome appearance of this plain ram statue, which is roughly of the same date and shares the same scale features as the Dangeil rams, well, the Dangeil rams would have looked something like this. So, taking this a little further, pigment and plaster discovered during the excavations of the kiosk have enabled a tentative reconstruction of the kiosk's decorative program. And you could see a candy-striped cornice in the upper left-hand corner, and the lower image is a section of its exterior wall. The colored arrows correspond to the coloring. So are you ready for this? So, the kiosk looked something like this. So if the rams are then added, in the 1st century AD, the sacred landscape of Dangeil would have appeared something like this. The ram, of course, being rotated 90 degrees. It was very colorful, and it's quite a contrast to what is visible there now. And we also have some of the pigments and the tools that were associated with the building decoration. So we have raw lumps of hematite, raw lumps of goethite, and the plastering tools, which tend to largely be reused sherds. Further light was cast on the temple's decorative program and the artistic techniques that were used during the excavation of the monumental gate. The scene here is a repeating frieze of lotus flowers consisting of an open blossom, followed at a lower level by a bud in the process of emerging, then by a flower in the process of opening. This image was part of the lowest register on the wall. So this is sort of the ground wallpaper around the base. There were red painted lines here that guided the artist to draw everything to the appropriate scale. So this is approximately 90 centimeters by 1.2 meters long, and this is one of the largest Kushite wall painting fragments that has been found so far in situ in a non-funerary context. As the wall was structurally unstable and the painting under threat, it was successfully removed by our conservation team last November, and we hope to have it in a local museum shortly on display. As the wall was structured, elsewhere in the sacred temenos, there's a low mound behind the temple, and it housed the temple kitchens, which produced food offerings for the cult. So we're now able to get some sort of idea of what the people are doing in the temple. What are the people doing here? These are some of the offering vessels, which in Egypt are referred to as bread molds. They're rough, they're conical, they've been intentionally broken, they're poorly made, and they seem to be for one use only. They're also only associated with Amun temples. Over 1.5 million mold sherds have been excavated so far. Though the time frame over which these were used, we're not sure. We don't know if they're making one offering a day, 2 offerings a day, if this amount is how many years, how many months. So we're not quite sure what the time frame is. And yes, if you're wondering, we did count the first 80,000 of them by hand. And then we estimated the remainder of them by bucket load. Because that seemed a much smarter idea. The remains of several cooking installations, marked here in red, were uncovered surrounded by ash and sherds. The density of the deposit is particularly visible on the section at the bottom. Most of the installations were made of ceramic store jars that had had their upper half removed, or both the upper and the lower half removed to just make a ceramic ring. These were then set in the ground and reused as hearths for cooking. And in case you're wondering what sort of offerings the Kushites are making to the god, the archaeobotanical analysis of the phytoliths, so that's silica plant remains, and starch from the potsherds and querns have identified the grain used as sorghum, not wheat. At Jebel Jaili, which is 120 kilometers east of Khartoum, there's a victory relief of King Shirakaror, and it shows the representation of a god, which appears to be inspired by deities from the eastern frontiers of the Roman Empire, offering a head of sorghum and, of course, a bunch of bound prisoners to the king. The use of sorghum suggests that rather than bread, as is found in Egypt, a fermented porridge, or more likely a beer, was the main form of offering. Sorghum's significant because the Kushites have adapted offering rituals seen in Egypt to suit their own needs and with their own resources. We have discovered numerous beer jars in the associated cemetery, so it looks like they were having a good time. The cemetery is northwest of the temple complex, and it is under threat by the expansion of the modern cemetery. To date, over 80 tombs have been excavated, and this population is roughly contemporary with the Amun temple and includes male and female adult burials, but almost all categories of age are represented. The population numbers around 170 individuals so far. So basically we have the temple and we have the people. No superstructures are visible on the surface, and the cemetery size has yet to be determined. The tombs have an east-west descendary leading to a north-south oval burial chamber at the west end. The burial chamber was sealed by a blocking wall. Normally there are 1 to 2 individuals to 3 in the chamber, and they're placed in a crouched position. Now, the excavations themselves in the cemetery have largely been undertaken by my co-director, Mahmoud Suleiman, and by our bioarchaeologists, Mohammed Saad and Anna Pieri, who you see here. And they're also analyzing the human remains. While most of these tombs have been robbed in antiquity, evidence suggests that many had been furnished with ceramic vessels and elaborate grave goods. Such as these, we found a silver ring bearing the image of the ram-headed god Amun, wearing an ataf crown, faience juglet, copper cups. There's also rare vessels of glass, which may be imported from Egypt or possibly from farther afield. We've also found this faience box lid, which has a partly preserved reclining leopard. It was in the fill of the descendary of one of these tombs. And it has parallels with another tomb, another lid, rather, dated to the 1st century AD from northern Sudan. And this piece is now in the Sudan National Museum. But fortunately, we also found the box that went with it, also in the descendary. And the ends are decorated with rosettes flanked by uraei, a cobra. And these cobra are wearing the white and the red crowns of Egypt and of Kush. And they have 2 large ujat eyes adorning each side. The legs are in the forms of duck heads, and the ends have the holes for the attachments of the lid. We don't actually know what this box contained. So, a mystery. I suspect it's probably a cosmetics or a toiletries box, but we really don't know. This molded ceramic applique of a satyr comes from a luxury vessel that was imported from the Hellenistic world, and as such was part of the prestige economy. Its presence in Dangeil village, along with the cemetery objects you've just seen of glass and silver and copper, are materials which are not available locally, and they reflect the prosperity and the status of some of the Kushite inhabitants. The satyr wears armlets, bracelets, anklets. He appears to hold a tambourine in a raised right arm, and he's dancing, or running, maybe. Dionysiac figures have been associated with the water sanctuary in the royal city of Merowe, and in the palace of King Natakamani and Queen Amani Tori at Jebel Barkal. And of course, these are the people who built this temple. The cemetery continued in use after the Kushite period. And amongst the most interesting are several burials of individuals who might have been archers, or in any case, it was wanted that they be associated with archery in the afterlife. There is a long history of people in the Middle Nile region being associated with archery. So these tombs here date to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The individuals are buried with arrowheads. They're wearing archers' rings on their thumbs, as you can see in the top. There's a rare leather quiver in the bottom. Now, moving back to the temple, the latest occupation on the site that's found so far is at the west end of the peristyle court. This area, between the rectangular ram statue plinths, had also been reused as a cemetery after the temple had ceased to function and had begun to collapse. And here we found 8 intact graves. Excuse me. The graves were cut through the flagstones of the processional way, and they clearly postdate the temple. I thought this was great because we have very little evidence for substantial reuse or secondary occupation elsewhere in the building, or in fact elsewhere on site. One of the nice things about Dangeil is literally you can dig and within 5 minutes you're right in the Kushite period. There's no later occupation on top. Now the tombs we found were oriented east-west, and they first appeared to be simple slot graves. And as such, they were presumed to be of medieval Christian date. But when we excavated it, it became clear that the situation was much more complicated. And you can see 4 of the tombs here beside the arrows. So I'll show you a little bit of what we found, beginning with this one. This tomb contained the burial of a juvenile, and he'd been wrapped in a wool shroud, or the juvenile had been buried in a wool shroud and then covered with a palm mat. When the mat was removed, the individual was slightly flexed on the right side with the head to the east. A white stone bracelet was on the left wrist, copper alloy rings and earrings, and a belt of ostrich eggshell, stone, and cowrie shell beads were also preserved. Here's a close-up of the pelvic girdle. You can also see fragments of the shroud as well in this image. Another grave, shown here in the blue circle, had been cut through the temple collapse, and in particular through some of the red brick column drum segments from a fallen column in the court. It was sealed by wooden beams supported on a ledge that ran around the inside of the grave cut. Broken red bricks had been laid on the beams in a ring. The tomb chamber itself was a shallow east-west oriented niche cut in the south wall of the shaft. This was the tomb of an adult woman who'd been buried in a wool shroud, again laid on her right side in a semi-flexed position. She'd been buried wearing numerous necklaces of green and yellow glass beads, a necklace of multifaceted cornelian beads, 19 copper alloy bracelets, copper finger rings, a belt of green and yellow glass beads, cornelian and white stone beads. This is a close-up of part of the belt that lay beneath her pelvis. Tomb 5 was similar both in plan and in the location of the burial niche. As with the previous tomb, the woman buried within was richly adorned with bracelets, anklets, necklaces, rings, and a beaded pelvic belt. The other tombs also contained burials of individuals similarly adorned. In total, the tombs excavated contained over 70 copper alloy bracelets, anklets, and more than 18,500 beads. To give you an idea of the weight of this material, the first woman I showed you, the woman of tomb 2, wore 13 copper bracelets and 1 iron bracelet on her left arm. This alone weighed 935 grams, almost a kilogram. This is not insubstantial. The large quantity of jewelry included in these tombs is unusual. And apart from the jewelry, there were no other grave goods to help us assist with the dating. All the deceased were identified as either adult women or juveniles, But it's too soon to draw any conclusions because the bioarchaeological analysis is underway still. We don't even know where the men of this group were buried, or even if they were buried in the area. The burial attitude of the deceased and the tomb chamber form are previously unattested in this area. Samples were AMS and bioaptite dated, and the results indicated that the tombs date to the medieval period between the 11th and the 13th centuries. At this time, the population of the area is ostensibly Christian and ruled by Christian kings. But the orientation of the deceased, the grave shape, the inclusion of the grave goods in these tombs does not follow Christian practice. Under normal liturgical circumstances, a medieval Christian individual, that's the 6th to the 13th century AD in this area, would have been buried in an extended position in an east-west orient grave, wrapped in a shroud with no grave goods. You don't have to take stuff with you to go to heaven. It's all there. So, the questions remain. Who is this group? And what is their relationship with the area? And where is all this copper and glass coming from? That's what we're working on at the moment. So, we've been undertaking extensive conservation work with the aim to protect, conserve, and preserve Dangeil for the future and to make it more accessible to visitors, basically to create an archaeological site park. And each season, conservation work carried out previously is reviewed and evaluated. Some conservation is quite challenging because parts of the buildings, in particular the walls, are such a mixture of different materials as you've seen. Issues of site management and accessibility are also being addressed together with the local village and with the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums. Streetlights were installed around the site with the assistance of the village council, and a public transit and water stop was built next to the road, the tarmac road, which is currently under construction. Builders from Dangeil have constructed an information point for visitors, and the panels will be installed shortly. And Dangeil does receive visitors, including local school groups, universities, interested members of the public, both from the village and elsewhere in Sudan, and foreign tourists. One of the issues we've been really struggling with to address is enabling visitors to view the carved columns and the panels in the sanctuary that you saw at the beginning. But we also need to keep these features secure and protected from destructive natural elements and from anthropogenic factors. The facings and the columns were conserved, and from 2003 until November of last year, that's 2.5 months ago, had been enclosed within temporary sealed protective structures. So, following consultations with conservators, architects, and builders, it was decided to roof the sanctuary area. This is an 18 by 16 meter space. Now, ideally, the whole temple should be enclosed under a protective shelter, but at that point, this is way beyond the resources we have available. So, this is the area before roofing, and this is the same area after the shelter was built. The structure is removable. This is the entrance shortly before completion, looking across the conserved northern half of the first hall. And this is the interior. The zinc and the fiberglass roof are supported by cantilevered steel beams and fired brick walls. There are drain pipes to enable rains to run off away from the building. The shelter was constructed by a professional team of builders from the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums, supported by builders from Dangeil Village. This is the survey team from the British School in Rome, Stephen King and Sophie Hay, surveying the shelter's interior and, in the process, paying homage to Indiana Jones's search for the map room and the Well of the Lost Souls. We've also been working together with local communities to promote a greater understanding of the site and of Sudan's heritage and history, creating, amongst other things, booklets in English and Arabic for the local schools and visitors. We hope to begin work shortly creating a regional museum in this building in the nearby town of Berber. This is the first medical clinic in Berber. It was built in 1903 during the Anglo-Egyptian colonial period. So it's a heritage building in and of itself. And it's actually a corrugated iron and beam structure sent to Sudan from Europe as a flat pack kit and assembled there. So what you're looking at is Victorian IKEA. So this is where we are now. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I'll leave you with one last thought. We were lucky enough to have a drone to take a number of site photos, some of which you've seen. Unfortunately, the drone apparently looked like a big pigeon, and the local raptors chased it out of the sky on numerous occasions. So we didn't get as many shots as we would have liked to have had. But we did manage a short fly through of the temple, which I'll show you now. This is before the shelter was constructed. So you'll be able to see the coverings that we've removed. Oops, go back. Let me see if I can get this. There we go. So we're at the main gate, and we're flying over the peristyle hall. You see the plinths for the statues and the kiosk and more statue plinths. And then into the first hall, into the second hall, the statue room on the right side of the screen, the sanctuary with the coverings, and then turning back and facing towards the main gate. So it just remains me to say the Berber Abadia Archaeological Project is very grateful for the assistance and support we've received from many different people, projects, and institutions, and particularly the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums Sudan, the Qatar Sudan Archaeological Project, the British Museum, the Institute for Bioarchaeology, and especially the people of Dangeil Village. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. Are you happy to take some questions? We have a few minutes,
sure,
if there are questions from the audience. Hands in the air if you've got them. There's one in the middle. If you could just wait until I come to you with the microphone, we'll capture this for the live streamers.
Thank you very much, Julie. It's absolutely fascinating and just amazing for us as classicists to see, the interaction of cultures on one of the, to us, edges of the Greco-Roman world that probably we know least about, really. I mean, absolutely fascinating. I just had a very quick question in complete ignorance, which is you showed us some of the points of Greco-Roman influence, and I wondered whether one of them is the peristyle features in the temple themselves, or whether that's a thing which is, you think is local.
The peristyle features are also found in Egyptian temples, and it's a copy of an Egyptian. It replicates many of the things found in Egyptian temples, temple at Karnak, that sort of thing, which predate certainly the Greco-Roman period.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I think we had another question at the front. Yes.
Thank you so much, Julie. How safe were you and your team? What was the security like? The Sudan's a very dangerous part of the world. And what sort of precautions did you have to take?
I've now worked in Sudan since 1987. And I have never had any problems whatsoever, ever. And obviously I started work as a very young woman there. And we have fantastic cooperation with our colleagues from the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums. And we have never had any problems whatsoever. If you look, for example, at the British FCO, Foreign Commonwealth Office, about safety and security, the area of Dangeil is always green. It's never been yellow or red color whatsoever. People hear a lot about, you get a lot of negative news in the press, because obviously that's more attractive than telling people good news. And there have been obviously issues in Darfur, issues in South Sudan. We're working in Sudan, which is now northern Sudan. And Darfur is quite a long way away from us. Darfur is the size of France. to give you a perspective. This is one of the largest countries in Africa. Before Southern Sudan separated, it was the largest country in Africa. To get to our site from Khartoum, now it only takes about 6.5 hours. And that's because we've been blessed with having a paved road. It used to take an awfully lot longer. So, no, I'm very grateful. We're very, very safe, fortunately. And we've also got good cooperation from the local government authorities.
That's great news. Thanks.
Question here in the middle.
I just had a brief question about the Queen of Meroe, who I think Strabo names as Kandake. Is that correct?
That's a title.
Yeah,
Kandake is title.
That's what I was going to ask you. It does bear some relationship to what we know from your sources, does it?
Yes, Kandake is written in Meroitic, and we can read Kandake.
Kind of looks like a Greek name. That's what I wanted to know about. I know a bit about Strabo, so I was interested in that particular passage.
The Kandake is either the queen or the queen mother. We can't always determine, but it's the most powerful woman in the royal household. And in fact, it's where the modern name Candace comes from, like Candace Bergen.
Yes.
We've got time just for one more question, I think.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing testament, I thought, to the power of community archaeology. I had a question about the polychrome. What do you think the symbolism is of so much blue for a temple? Because it's quite unusual to see things painted all in blue, at least in the Greco-Roman world. Is it water? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Blue is, at least in terms of animals like sheep, is often thought to represent gray sometimes. And of course, sheep are sort of a grayish color on occasion, depending on what they've been doing. But what is also is evident here is they don't have as a wide choice of pigments that they're using. We basically have black from charcoal, and then white from a local lime, and then the man-made blue, which is introduced in Egypt long before the 1st century AD, and then the two local colors, the yellow, the ochres. And I think part of it is a reflection of what they have available and what they're able to produce. But yes, there are certain symbolisms. For example, the red of the ram's eyes, they think may be symbolic of representing light reflecting off an animal's eyes at night. But, I mean, we don't actually know because we don't have anything to tell us that that's what it means. It's all hypothesis at this point.
Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time for any further questions, and it remains for me to hand over now to Dr. Megan Daniels, who's here at UNE in the Department of Classics and Ancient History, who's going to give the vote of thanks.
Julie, what a treat. Thank you. A lot of talk that goes into, as you might know and be aware of, into diversifying classics and the humanities more generally. And part of that goal involves expanding our scope of human history and dissolving often artificial boundaries that we draw around human groups, geographical regions, even academic subjects. So, Julie, your talk has brought so much insight, from temples to tombs to colors to queens. More than that, it's brought so much insight to places and peoples and history that many of us don't get to visit in our everyday interests, in our everyday teaching and research. And of course, your talk also challenges us to take a more expansive view of human history and also human heritage, and above all, to think about the service that should come from our academic work. I know that working in Sudan has been a passion of yours for over 30 years now, and how wonderful it is to see your passion realized in such great service to the field, such great service to Sudan, and also such great service to understanding human heritage more generally. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Julie for such a wonderful talk and for the work you do in general. And with that, I think it's time to eat for some people.